Chapter 1: Roots of the Past. The December wind swept through the Blue Ridge Valley, carrying with it a faint scent of pine and frost. Ivy Greenwood sat in her car at the edge of the driveway, hands clutching the steering wheel as she stared at the place she had once called home. The Greenwood Tree Farm sprawled before her, its once vibrant rows of evergreens now weighed down by the stillness of neglect. Frost dusted the ground like an unrolled carpet of silver, glinting under the pale afternoon light. Her breath fogged the windshield, a reminder of the bitter cold outside, but Ivy made no move to open the door. She wasn't sure what was more daunting, the prospect of saving the farm or confronting the memories that lingered like ghosts in every corner of the property. The farmhouse loomed at the top of the hill, its white paint weathered to a dull gray and its shutters hanging slightly askew. It was as if the place had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to bring it back to life, or to lay it to rest. Ivy finally exhaled, her breath visible in the chill of the car's cabin. She tugged on her gloves and reached for the door handle, the creak of the hinge breaking the heavy silence. Stepping out, she was immediately enveloped by the cold, the air sharp and unforgiving. Her boots crunched against the frost-laden gravel as she made her way up the driveway, her eyes scanning the farm with a mixture of nostalgia and unease. The rows of evergreens stretched out in neat, regimented lines, but their branches hung limp, their vibrant green dulled by years of insufficient care. Ivy remembered the pride her father had taken in these trees, each one planted with intention and nurtured with care. He used to say the farm was alive, that its roots were connected to the heart of the family. But now, it seemed as if both had withered in tandem. She reached the farmhouse steps, her gloved hand brushing the railing. The wood was cold and rough, splinters threatening to pierce the fabric. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The familiar creak of the hinges echoed in the empty hallway, stirring a flurry of memories. Inside, the air was still and faintly scented with the pine wreaths her mother had always insisted on hanging by the windows. Dust motes swirled in the weak light filtering through the curtains, their patterns hypnotic. The kitchen door stood ajar, revealing glimpses of the heart of the home where her mother had once baked cookies and her father had warmed cider on the old stove. "Ivy," her mother's voice broke the quiet, soft but tinged with relief. Ivy turned to see her standing at the base of the stairs, wrapped in a cardigan that seemed far too thin for the weather. Her hair, once a fiery auburn, had faded to silver streaked with white, and her face bore the lines of years spent worrying. "Mom," Ivy said, the word catching in her throat. Her mother crossed the room and enveloped her in a hug that felt both familiar and fragile, as if she were holding on to something that might slip away at any moment. "I wasn't sure you'd come," her mother admitted, stepping back and brushing at her eyes. "I wasn't sure either," Ivy replied honestly, her gaze drifting to the mantel where family photos still stood in mismatched frames. Her mother followed her line of sight. "It's been hard," she said softly. "The farm, it's not what it used to be, and I don't think I can keep it going alone." Ivy nodded, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She had spent years building a life in the city, a life far removed from the demands of the farm. But as she looked around, she realized how deeply the place was rooted in her. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in shades of gold and purple, Ivy found herself in the attic. The air up there was colder, the beams creaking under her weight as she navigated the space. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, their labels faded with age. She tugged at one marked Christmas ornaments, the scent of cedar spilling into the air as the lid came loose. Her eyes caught on a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon, tucked into the corner of the box. She pulled it free, her fingers brushing the brittle edges of what appeared to be journals. The leather cover of the topmost journal was embossed with a single word, hope. Ivy's breath caught. These weren't ordinary journals. They were old, far older than anything else in the attic. As she flipped through the first pages, she saw delicate handwriting, the ink slightly faded but legible. December 14th, 1873. The date made her pause. Her heart quickened as she read the first lines, a story unfolding of a love bound to this farm, and to the holly grove that lay at its heart. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Attic. The house was quiet as Ivy climbed the creaking staircase to the attic. The dim glow of a single bulb illuminated the narrow hallway leading to the attic door, its wood scratched and worn from decades of use. In her childhood, the attic had been a place of wonder, where forgotten treasures and mysteries waited to be uncovered. Now, it felt like a relic of another time, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid and undone. She reached the door and hesitated. The doorknob was cold against her hand, and for a moment, she imagined it was the house itself holding its breath, as though waiting for her to cross into its secrets. Ivy turned the knob slowly, the hinges groaning in protest as the door swung open. A rush of cold air greeted her, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar and old paper. The attic was exactly as she remembered it, cluttered, chaotic, and endlessly intriguing. Boxes were stacked in uneven piles, some labeled in her mother's neat handwriting, others bearing scrawls from decades past. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like forgotten ghosts in the corners, their outlines barely discernible in the weak light filtering through a single dusty window. Ivy stepped inside, her boots stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the air. She ran her fingers along the edge of a wooden chest, its brass hinges tarnished and its surface marked with scratches. She remembered this chest. It had belonged to her great-grandmother and was filled with old quilts and linens. But tonight, her focus was elsewhere. Her eyes scanned the attic, searching for anything that might offer a clue about the farm's history or the holly grove that had captivated her since she was a child. Her father had often spoken of the grove with a reverence that bordered on myth, describing it as the heart of the farm. But he had never explained why it was so important, and now, with him gone, the answers seemed buried as deeply as the roots of the trees themselves. Near the back of the attic, partially hidden beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers, Ivy spotted a wooden crate she didn't recognize. The wood was dark with age, and a rusted padlock hung loosely from its latch. Ivy crouched down, brushing away the dust and papers to reveal the word Holly carved into the side in uneven letters. Her heart quickened. She tugged at the padlock, and to her surprise, it gave way easily, the metal crumbling under her grip. Lifting the lid, she found a collection of items that seemed out of place in the otherwise practical attic. There were faded photographs, the edges curling and the images barely visible. A bundle of letters tied with a fraying ribbon, and, resting at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal. Ivy picked up the journal, her fingers brushing the soft, worn leather. The cover was embossed with an intricate design of holly leaves, their veins etched in delicate lines. She opened it to the first page, where a date was scrawled in faded ink, December 21st, 1898. She turned the page, her eyes catching on the careful handwriting that filled the lines. Today, I walked among the holly grove again, as I have done every day since we planted it. There is something sacred about this place, something that breathes life into the very ground beneath my feet. I cannot explain it, but I feel it, an energy, a promise. The grove is more than trees. It is a gift, one I fear I may never fully understand. Ivy frowned, her fingers tracing the words. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate, the kind of script that spoke of a different era. As she read on, the entries grew more enigmatic, filled with references to the grove as a source of power, a place of sanctuary, and, strangely, a place of love. One passage caught her attention. They say the holly is a symbol of protection, its sharp leaves warding off evil. But I believe it is also a symbol of the heart, resilient, enduring, and evergreen, even in the harshest winter. Perhaps that is why I feel so drawn to it, why I feel my soul is tied to these trees. The words stirred something deep within Ivy. She closed the journal and glanced at the other items in the crate. The photographs were faded, their subjects barely discernible, but one in particular stood out. A man and a woman standing in front of a grove of holly trees, their faces alight with joy. The woman's hand rested on the man's arm, and around her wrist, Ivy could just make out the glint of a bracelet shaped like holly leaves. She set the photograph aside and untied the bundle of letters. The paper was fragile, the ink smudged in places, but as she read the first letter, her breath caught. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "the holly grove is as beautiful as ever, though it pales in comparison to you. I cannot wait until we are together again, walking beneath its branches and dreaming of the future we will build." The letter was signed with a single initial, E. Ivy sat back, the attic's chill seeping into her skin. The grove, the journal, the letters, they were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a story she didn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. The holly grove was more than a part of the farm. It was a legacy, one that had shaped the lives of those who came before her, and, perhaps, one that would shape hers as well. She glanced at the journal, its cover gleaming faintly in the dim light. It felt heavy in her hands, not with its weight, but with its meaning. As she stood and gathered the crate's contents, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that she had taken the first step on a path she was destined to follow, a path that would lead her back to the heart of the farm and to herself. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Grove. Dawn broke over the farm, painting the landscape in shades of soft gold and frostbitten silver. Ivy stood at the kitchen window, cradling a steaming mug of tea, her gaze fixed on the holly grove in the distance. It was a familiar sight, yet today, it felt different. The trees stood like sentinels against the horizon, their evergreen leaves shimmering faintly in the weak sunlight, their crimson berries bright as drops of blood against the white frost. The journal and letters lay on the kitchen table behind her, their presence as heavy as the questions they carried. Ivy had spent half the night poring over them, her mind tangled in the story they hinted at. The words spoke of love and devotion, but also of mystery, of secrets rooted deep in the earth beneath the grove. A sharp knock at the back door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. Turning, she saw Noel standing on the porch, his breath visible in the cold morning air. His face was flushed from the chill, and his ever-present scarf was wrapped haphazardly around his neck. He gestured through the window, and Ivy sighed, setting her mug down before opening the door. The air that rushed in was bracing, and she shivered as it swept over her. "I wasn't sure if you'd be up," Noel said, stepping inside and rubbing his hands together for warmth. His boots left faint impressions on the worn floorboards, bringing with them the scent of pine and snow. "I couldn't sleep," Ivy admitted, glancing at the table. Noel followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "What's all this?" Ivy hesitated. Sharing the discovery felt like inviting someone else into a world she was only beginning to understand. But Noel had always been a part of the farm, even if their paths had diverged in recent years. If anyone could help her untangle the threads of this mystery, it was him. She picked up the journal and handed it to him. "I found this in the attic, along with letters and some photographs. They all seemed connected to the holly grove." Noel flipped through the pages, his expression thoughtful. "This is old," he murmured, "and detailed. Whoever wrote this cared deeply about the grove." Ivy nodded. "There's more," she said, retrieving one of the letters. "They mention a woman named Margaret and someone with the initial E." I think they're tied to the farm, but I don't know how." Noel read the letter silently, his lips pressing into a thin line. When he looked up, his blue eyes were alight with curiosity. "This isn't just history, Ivy. This is personal. If these people were connected to the grove, they were connected to your family. We need to find out who they were." The determination in his voice mirrored her own, and Ivy felt a flicker of gratitude. Despite their differences, Noel had always shared her love for the farm. His passion for preserving its legacy had once inspired her. Perhaps it could again. "I was thinking the same thing," she admitted. "But I don't know where to start." "Sometimes, the best place to start is the beginning," Noel said, his gaze drifting to the window. The grove itself might hold answers. The suggestion was both obvious and daunting. Ivy had walked among the holly trees countless times, but she had never thought to see them as more than part of the landscape. Now, they seemed imbued with a significance she couldn't ignore. By mid-morning, Ivy and Noel were standing at the edge of the grove, the air crisp and filled with the faint scent of pine and earth. The holly trees rose around them, their branches weaving a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The grove was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Ivy felt a strange energy here, a hum beneath the surface that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She glanced at Noel, who was studying the trees with a mix of reverence and curiosity. "They're older than I thought," he said, running his hand along the rough bark of a trunk. "Some of these trees could be over a century old." Ivy nodded, her fingers brushing against a cluster of berries. "Do you think they were planted for a reason?" "The journal mentions the grove as a place of power, almost sacred." "It's possible," Noel said thoughtfully. "Holly has a lot of symbolism: protection, endurance, even love. If the grove was important to your ancestors, it might have been more than just a farm feature. Maybe it was a sanctuary." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ivy's gaze drifted to the heart of the grove, where the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining like clasped hands. She felt an inexplicable pull toward that spot, as though the grove itself was calling her. Without a word, she stepped forward, weaving through the trees with Noel close behind. The ground beneath their feet grew softer, covered in a carpet of moss that muffled their footsteps. The air felt different here, warmer and more alive. In the center of the grove, Ivy stopped. A small clearing opened before them, ringed by the tallest holly trees she had ever seen. In the middle of the clearing stood a single stone pedestal, weathered and covered in ivy. Resting atop it was a carved wooden box, its surface etched with the same holly leaf design as the journal. Noel let out a low whistle. "Now that's something you don't see every day." Ivy approached the pedestal cautiously, her heart pounding. The box was delicate, its wood darkened by age, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. She reached out, hesitating for only a moment before lifting the lid. Inside was a small locket, its silver surface engraved with the initials M and E. A folded piece of paper lay beneath it, yellowed with age. Ivy unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the handwritten words. "For as long as the grove stands, so too will our love endure." Her breath caught. The connection between Margaret and E had suddenly become tangible, their love story preserved in this hidden sanctuary. Ivy glanced at Noel, who was watching her with quiet intensity. "This grove isn't just a part of the farm," she said softly. "It's a part of them. And maybe it's a part of us too." Noel's expression softened. "Then we have to protect it, whatever it takes." As they stood in the grove's embrace, surrounded by the whispers of the past, Ivy felt a spark of hope. The answers they sought might still be hidden, but for the first time in years, she felt certain of one thing. The Holly Grove was more than a legacy. It was a beginning. Chapter 4. The Winter Bloom. The day was fading into twilight when Ivy returned to the kitchen, the wooden box from the grove tucked under her arm. The locket and letter felt heavier than they should, as though they carried the weight of the emotions etched into their existence. Noel had stayed behind, examining the grove with a fascination that mirrored her own, but Ivy had needed a moment alone to process what they'd uncovered. The house seemed quieter than usual, the walls holding their breath. Ivy placed the box on the kitchen table, the soft thunk echoing in the stillness. She slid into a chair and opened the box once more, her fingers lingering on the delicate locket. The initials M and E gleamed faintly in the dim light, a testament to the lives they represented. Who were Margaret and E? The journal and letters hinted at a love story entwined with the farm, but there were still so many questions. Why had their connection to the grove been so profound? And why did the grove feel alive, as though it remembered their story and whispered it to those who would listen? Ivy traced the locket's design, her thoughts drifting back to the pedestal in the grove. The stone had been worn smooth by time, the ivy creeping across its surface like veins carrying life to its heart. There was something sacred about that space, something that demanded respect and reverence. Her mother had rarely spoken about the grove, dismissing it as just another part of the farm, but Ivy had always felt there was more to it. Now, with the journal, letters, and artifacts in hand, she was certain of it. The grove was a cornerstone of her family's history, a living archive of the emotions and choices that had shaped their lives. The sound of boots on the porch pulled Ivy from her thoughts. The door creaked open, and Noel stepped inside. His cheeks flushed from the cold. He carried a bundle of holly branches, their leaves sharp and glossy, their berries vivid against the green. "I thought these might help," he said, setting them on the counter. They were scattered near the clearing. Ivy nodded, her gaze lingering on the branches. They seemed to glow faintly in the warm light, as though they carried the grove's essence. Noel pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his eyes flicking to the box. "Have you figured anything out?" "Not much," Ivy admitted, holding up the locket. "But this, it feels important, like it was meant to be found." Noel leaned forward, studying the locket with a mix of curiosity and reverence. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "And the initials, M and E. Do you think they're the same Margaret and E from the letters?" "I'm almost certain," Ivy said, "but I don't know who they were or why their story is tied to the grove. There's something missing, something I haven't found yet." Noel nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the journal on the table. "Then we keep looking. The answers are here somewhere. We just have to uncover them." His determination was infectious, and Ivy felt a spark of hope. The farm, the grove, and the artifacts, they were all pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. And for the first time, Ivy felt she wasn't facing it alone. As the night deepened, the two of them worked side by side, combing through the journal and letters. They spread the photographs across the table, trying to piece together the fragments of the past. Each discovery added another layer to the story, but it also raised more questions. One letter in particular caught Ivy's attention. It was shorter than the others, the handwriting hurried and uneven. "Dearest Margaret, the grove is in danger. If anything happens to me, promise me you'll protect it. It's more than trees. It's our sanctuary, our bond. Without it, we are nothing. E." Ivy stared at the letter, her heart pounding. The urgency in the words was palpable, as was the fear. What had threatened the grove? And what had happened to E? She looked up at Noel, who was studying a faded photograph of the grove. "Do you think this has something to do with the farm struggles?" she asked. Noel glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "It's possible. If the grove was as important as these letters make it seem, then whatever threatened it might have had long-lasting effects. Maybe the farm's history is more complicated than we thought." The thought was both troubling and intriguing. Ivy felt a deep sense of responsibility to uncover the truth, not just for herself but for the farm and the legacy it represented. The grove was more than a place. It was a testament to the resilience of love and the power of connection. As the hours passed, the kitchen grew warmer, the scent of holly mingling with the faint aroma of tea. Ivy and Noel worked in companionable silence, their shared purpose bridging the gap that had grown between them over the years. When Ivy finally stood to stretch, she glanced at the window. The moon hung low in the sky, its light casting a silvery glow over the farm. She felt a strange sense of peace, as though the grove was watching over them, its silent presence a reminder of the strength and beauty hidden in the shadows. "We'll figure this out," Noel said, his voice steady and sure. "Whatever the grove's secret is, we'll uncover it together." Ivy nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for the farm, but for herself. The past might hold its share of pain and mystery, but it also held the promise of understanding and renewal. As she closed the box and set it aside, Ivy felt a quiet determination settle over her. The grove's secrets might be buried deep, but she was ready to unearth them, one step at a time. Chapter 5. A Rivalry Rekindled. The morning dawned with a pale, wintry light that seemed to struggle through the dense cloud cover. Ivy stood at the edge of the grove, the box from the night before nestled in her arms. She had spent hours replaying the contents of the journal and letters in her mind, the cryptic phrases weaving a tapestry of mystery and intrigue. Noel had left shortly after midnight, his promise to return early a quiet reassurance in the stillness of the house. True to his word, his truck rumbled up the gravel drive just as the sun tipped above the horizon, its rays barely cutting through the cold mist clinging to the farm. "Morning," Noel called as he stepped out, his breath forming faint clouds in the icy air. He carried a canvas bag slung over one shoulder and waved a trowel in greeting. "I thought we'd start with the grove itself." Ivy raised an eyebrow. "Digging? What are we looking for?" "Anything that might give us a better idea of what's been hidden here," Noel replied, his tone practical. If Margaret and E went to the trouble of making the grove their sanctuary, maybe they left more than a box and a locket. The suggestion made sense, though Ivy couldn't shake the feeling of disturbing something sacred. Still, her curiosity outweighed her hesitation. She nodded, leading Noel into the grove. The trees loomed tall and silent, their presence as commanding as ever. Ivy felt a shiver run down her spine as they entered the heart of the grove, the clearing with its ivy-covered pedestal still and undisturbed. The pedestal, she realized, seemed to watch over the space like a sentinel, its purpose rooted in something ancient. Noel set the canvas bag down and began unpacking its contents. A small spade, a soft brush, and a pair of gloves. "We'll start around the pedestal," he said, glancing at Ivy. "You take the right. I'll take the left." Kneeling on the mossy ground, Ivy began to dig carefully, her fingers brushing aside leaves and loose soil. The earth beneath the grove was rich and dark, its scent fresh and grounding. She worked in silence, the rhythm of her movements mirrored by Noel across the clearing. It wasn't long before her spade hit something solid. Ivy's breath caught as she cleared the soil around the object, revealing a small wooden carving. It was simple but beautiful, depicting a holly branch intertwined with ivy. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and the piece seemed almost untouched by time. "Noel," she called softly, holding up the carving. He looked up, his expression shifting to one of awe. "That's incredible. It matches the designs on the box and the locket." Ivy nodded, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It feels like a symbol, something they left behind to mark their bond." As they continued digging, more artifacts emerged. A tarnished silver coin, a fragment of what appeared to be an old brooch, and a small glass vial sealed with wax. Each item felt imbued with meaning, though their exact significance remained elusive. The glass vial caught Ivy's attention. She held it up to the light, noticing a faint shimmer inside. "What do you think this is?" she asked, handing it to Noel. He examined it closely, tilting it back and forth. It could be anything: perfume, ink, maybe even something ceremonial. Whatever it is, it was important enough to bury. Ivy's mind raced with possibilities. The grove wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a repository of memories, a place where Margaret and he had poured their love and their secrets. After several hours of careful excavation, the two of them sat back, surveying their finds. The pedestal surroundings now held a small collection of artifacts, each one a piece of the puzzle they were trying to solve. Noel leaned against a tree, his face thoughtful. "This is more than I expected," he admitted. "But it still doesn't tell us the whole story. It's like we're piecing together a mosaic," Ivy said, her gaze drifting to the pedestal. "Each fragment is beautiful on its own, but we won't see the full picture until we find the missing pieces." Noel nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the pedestal. "Do you think there's anything inside it?" The question sent a ripple of anticipation through Ivy. The pedestal had seemed solid, immovable, but now she wondered if it held more secrets within its ivy-covered surface. Approaching it cautiously, Noel began brushing away the vines. The stone was cool and smooth beneath his fingers, its surface etched with faint markings that had been obscured by time and growth. "There's something here," he said, his voice laced with excitement. "Look at these carvings." Ivy stepped closer, her heart pounding as she traced the patterns with her fingers. They resembled the holly and ivy designs they'd seen on the artifacts, but these were more intricate, almost like a map. As they worked to uncover more of the pedestal, Ivy felt a deep connection to the grove, as though the trees themselves were bearing witness to their discovery. The air grew warmer, the sunlight filtering through the branches in golden streams that illuminated their work. Finally, they found a small indentation near the base of the pedestal. Noel pressed against it, and with a soft groan, a hidden panel slid open. Inside was a shallow compartment lined with velvet, its contents shrouded in shadows. Ivy reached in, her fingers brushing against something smooth and cool. She pulled out a small metal box, its surface adorned with the same holly motif. Holding her breath, she opened it. Inside was a stack of folded papers, their edges frayed with age. Ivy carefully unfolded the top sheet, her eyes scanning the handwritten words. "To the keeper of the grove, these trees hold our story, our love, and our legacy. Protect them, and they will protect you. For as long as the holly stands, so too shall we." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced at Noel, who was reading over her shoulder, his expression a mix of wonder and resolve. "This isn't just history," he said softly. "It's a promise, a bond that's lasted generations." Ivy nodded, her fingers tightening around the paper. The grove's secrets were more profound than she had imagined, their significance stretching far beyond her family. It was a connection to the past, a thread of love and resilience that bound her to the land and to those who had come before her. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grove, Ivy felt a newfound determination. The farm and its legacy were worth fighting for, and she wasn't alone in the battle. Together, she and Noel would uncover the full story and ensure that the grove's legacy endured for generations to come. Chapter 6: Branches of Truth. The fog rolled in overnight, blanketing the farm in a thick, silvery haze. Ivy awoke to the muffled stillness that came with such mornings, the air heavy and damp. The grove, visible from her bedroom window, appeared as little more than a shadowed silhouette in the distance, its mysteries cloaked once again. She sat at the edge of her bed, the metal box from the pedestal resting on her lap. The papers inside had consumed her thoughts since yesterday's discovery. Each word, meticulously inked in the delicate handwriting of a time long past, seemed to carry an urgency that resonated with her. She had read them over and over, trying to piece together the story they told. A story that felt as much hers as it did Margaret's or E's. Downstairs, the aroma of coffee filled the kitchen. Noel was already there, leaning against the counter with a steaming mug in hand. His jacket was slung over a chair, damp from the morning mist. "You're up early," Ivy remarked, setting the box on the table as she joined him. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Too much on my mind." "You?" "Same," she said, glancing at the box. "I've been thinking about those letters all night. The grove, the artifacts. It's like they're speaking to us, but I can't quite hear what they're saying." Noel nodded thoughtfully. "I was going to head out there again, see if there's anything we missed. But with this fog..." His voice trailed off, and Ivy followed his gaze to the window. The fog was impenetrable, a sea of gray that erased the horizon. It was as if the grove had withdrawn into itself, hiding its secrets once more. "We'll have to wait," she said, though the thought frustrated her. The grove felt like a living thing, its moods and movements dictating their progress. Noel set his mug down and crossed to the table. "While we wait, let's go through these again," he said, gesturing to the papers. "Maybe there's something we overlooked." They spread the papers out on the table, each one a fragment of the past. The handwriting varied in tone and emotion. Some letters were tender, others filled with worry or determination. But all of them hinted at a deeper connection between Margaret, E, and the grove. One letter caught Noel's attention. It was dated December 15th, 1872, and the ink was slightly smudged, as though written in haste. "Dearest Margaret, the storm is worsening, and I fear the grove may not survive the night. The elders warned us, but I didn't listen. I believed our love would be enough to protect it. Now I see that it requires more than sentiment. It requires sacrifice. If I cannot be with you, know that my heart remains in the grove, forever bound to its roots. Yours always, E." Noel frowned as he read the letter aloud. Sacrifice? What do you think he meant by that? Ivy shook her head, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "I don't know, but it's clear that something happened, a storm, maybe something worse. Whatever it was, it left its mark on the grove and on them." The word sacrifice lingered in the air, heavy and unsettling. Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that E's words hinted at a deeper truth, one that she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. By midday, the fog began to lift, revealing the grove in fragments as the sunlight broke through. Ivy and Noel bundled up against the chill and made their way back to the clearing, the silence between them charged with anticipation. The grove was eerily quiet, its usual hum of life subdued. Ivy felt a strange sense of unease as they approached the pedestal, the artifacts they had uncovered yesterday still scattered around its base. Noel crouched beside the pedestal, his fingers brushing against the carvings they had revealed. "These markings, they almost look like directions," he said, his voice low. "Directions to what?" Ivy asked, kneeling beside him. "I'm not sure," Noel admitted. "But if you follow the pattern, it seems to point toward the far end of the grove." Ivy's heart quickened. The grove was large, its boundaries stretching beyond what they had explored. If there was something hidden deeper within, it could hold the answers they were searching for. Together, they followed the markings, weaving through the trees as the grove seemed to close in around them. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, as though they were descending into another world. Eventually, they came upon a small, sunken area surrounded by holly bushes. At the center was a stone well, its edges crumbling with age but still intact. Ivy approached cautiously, her steps crunching against the frosted ground. The well radiated an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She peered over the edge, the darkness within seeming to stretch infinitely. "This must be it," Noel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ivy nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the well. She felt a pull toward it, as though it were calling to her. Noel rummaged in his bag and pulled out a flashlight. He shone the beam into the well, revealing a narrow shaft lined with moss-covered stones. At the bottom, something glinted faintly in the light. "There's something down there," he said, excitement creeping into his tone. Ivy's breath caught. Whatever lay at the bottom of the well could be the key to unlocking the grove's secrets. But the thought of descending into the darkness sent a shiver through her. Noel seemed to sense her hesitation. "We'll come back with proper equipment," he said gently. "This isn't something we should rush into." Ivy nodded, though her curiosity burned brighter than ever. The grove had led them to this moment, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the well held the answers they had been searching for. As they made their way back to the house, the fog began to roll in again, swallowing the grove in its gray embrace. Ivy glanced over her shoulder, the silhouette of the well barely visible through the mist. The grove's secrets were within reach, but they came with a warning. The past was not easily uncovered, and its echoes carried a weight that could not be ignored. Chapter 7. Secrets Beneath the Snow. The fog lingered for days, a constant companion that hung over the farm like an unspoken secret. Ivy felt its weight in every corner of the house, in every step she took through the grove, and in every turn of the page she read in the ancient letters. It was as though the fog had seeped into her very thoughts, clouding the edges of her memory and filling her mind with questions that seemed to have no answers. For the first time in weeks, she found herself wishing for a moment of clarity, a break from the oppressive silence that had taken over her life. The world beyond the fog felt distant, and yet the grove pulled at her, its mysteries demanding to be unraveled. Noel had been restless ever since their visit to the well. His mind was clearly preoccupied, and Ivy could see it in the way he wandered around the farm, his eyes always searching the horizon, as though waiting for something or someone to appear. "I think it's time we go back," he said one evening, his voice carrying a sense of urgency that Ivy hadn't expected. She glanced up from the book she had been reading, surprised by the intensity in his tone. "Back to the well?" she asked. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "There's something about it, Ivy. I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something. I know it sounds crazy, but I think there's more to it than just a hidden artifact or a clue." Ivy hesitated. The thought of returning to the well, of descending into its dark, suffocating depths, was unnerving. But Noel's conviction was impossible to ignore. She could see it in his eyes, that same restless spark that had led them to this point. "I'll get the equipment," she said, standing up and grabbing her coat. The night was cold and clear when they finally made their way back to the grove. The fog had receded slightly, but there was still an eerie calm in the air. As they walked toward the well, Ivy's heart quickened. The grove seemed quieter tonight, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. They reached the well in silence, the glow of the flashlight casting long shadows across the moss-covered stones. Ivy could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the unseen eyes of Margaret and he watching from the edges of the grove. The thought made her uneasy, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Noel knelt beside the well, carefully inspecting the stone rim. "There's a loose stone here," he said, pushing aside a layer of vines and leaves. "It might be part of the mechanism." Ivy stepped closer, her breath visible in the cool air. "What mechanism?" He met her gaze, his brow furrowed. "I don't think the well was just built for water. I think it was meant to conceal something. A hidden chamber, a passage, maybe even a vault." Ivy swallowed, feeling a chill run down her spine. Are we sure we want to open it? Noel hesitated, his fingers resting on the stone. No, we're not sure. But we've come this far, and I can't let it go. His words hung in the air, and Ivy felt an undeniable pull to follow him, to uncover whatever lay hidden in the darkness. She nodded, reaching for the flashlight. Together, they worked to remove the stone. The air grew colder as the ground beneath their hands shifted, the earth seemingly alive with the weight of history. When the stone finally gave way, a loud creak echoed through the grove, followed by a deep, hollow thud. Ivy recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. What was that? Noel's voice was low, filled with awe. I think we've just unlocked something. Beneath the stone was a narrow staircase, barely visible in the flickering light. It descended into the darkness, its steps worn and uneven. Ivy hesitated, her pulse racing. She had never been afraid of the woods or the farm, but there was something about the well, something about the shadow it cast, that made her feel like she was stepping into a world that wasn't her own. Noel, we don't know what's down there, she said, her voice trembling. I know, he replied, his tone steady, but I'm not turning back now. We have to know. With a deep breath, Ivy stepped forward, her foot landing on the first step. The cold stone pressed against her skin as she descended, the darkness wrapping around her like a thick cloak. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of earth and moss. As they reached the bottom, the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, sending a shiver down her spine. The flashlight beam revealed a small chamber, its walls lined with ancient stone and covered in a thick layer of ivy and moss. At the far end of the room, a pedestal stood, much like the one in the grove, its surface worn but still intact. Ivy's breath caught as she saw what lay upon it. A box, almost identical to the one they had found earlier, sat on the pedestal, its surface covered in the same holly and ivy motif. But this one was different. This one had a lock. Do you think this is the key to the grove's secret? Ivy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Noel nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the box. I think this is what we've been looking for, but I don't know what it means yet. Ivy stepped forward, her heart pounding as she reached for the box. The lock was old, rusted, but not impossible to open. She glanced at Noel, who was watching her with an intensity that mirrored her own. With a twist, the lock clicked open. The lid creaked as Ivy lifted it, revealing what lay inside. At first, she couldn't make sense of it. A collection of faded papers, a small key, and a vial filled with something dark and liquid, its contents swirling as though alive. But it was the last item that made her gasp. A small, intricately carved figure of a woman, holding a holly branch in one hand and an ivy vine in the other. This is it, Noel whispered, his voice reverent. This is the figure from the journal, the one he described. Ivy nodded, her fingers trembling as she picked up the figure. It was heavy, solid, and yet it seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though it had been waiting for them to find it. She met Noel's gaze. This is what they were protecting. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. The grove, the well, the artifacts, they were all part of a story that had been buried for generations. A story that wasn't just about Margaret and E, but about something greater, something tied to the very land they stood on. And now, with the figure in her hands, Ivy knew they had uncovered a key to the past that could change everything. But as she stood there, holding the relic, a cold gust of wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the flashlight and plunging them into darkness. Ivy's breath caught, and she could feel the weight of something unseen pressing in on them. The shadows seemed to stretch, the walls of the chamber closing in around them. A voice whispered through the darkness, its words carried on the wind. You should not have come. Chapter 8. The Language of Holly. The voice hung in the air, a whisper carried on the wind, its words just faint enough to send a shiver down Ivy's spine. She froze, the figure in her hands growing heavier with each passing second. The chamber was engulfed in an unnatural stillness, the only sound the soft drip of water somewhere in the distance. Noel's breath was shallow, and Ivy could feel the tension in the air thickening, pressing down on them like a physical force. He turned toward her, his eyes wide with alarm. "Did you hear that?" Ivy nodded, her throat tight.
Yes.
The words had come from nowhere, yet they had been undeniably real. There was no one else down here with them. Not that she could see, at least. But the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam, was overwhelming. She gripped the figure tighter, as though its weight could ground her in reality. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The silence stretched, suffocating in its intensity. Ivy waited, her heart pounding, but no answer came. No footsteps, no rustling in the leaves, just that oppressive silence. And then, in the quiet, the faintest sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic thud, like the beating of a distant heart. It was faint at first, but as she strained to listen, it grew louder, closer, as though something, or someone, was moving through the chamber with them. Noel stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. His voice was barely a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the heavy air around them. "We need to leave.
Now."
But Ivy didn't move. She couldn't. There was something about this place, something about the figure in her hands that anchored her here, as though it held the answers to questions she hadn't even asked yet. "I can't," she whispered. "I think this is important. This figure. It's the key to everything." Noel grabbed her arm, his grip tight but gentle. "Ivy, whatever it is, it can wait. We need to get out of here before we find out what's causing that sound." Ivy opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, a loud crack echoed from the far side of the chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was approaching. Noel's hand tightened around her wrist. "Ivy, please. We have to go." His voice was urgent now, his fear creeping through the cracks in his calm demeanor. But Ivy's gaze was fixed on the far corner of the chamber, where the shadows seemed to deepen, as though something was emerging from the very walls. The footsteps grew louder, and then, through the shifting darkness, a figure began to materialize. It was tall, shrouded in a cloak of shadows, its face obscured by a hood. Ivy's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see its features clearly, but she could feel the presence of it, ancient, powerful, and old beyond measure. It stood motionless, watching them with an intensity that made Ivy's blood run cold. "Who are you?" Ivy asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. The figure didn't answer. It simply tilted its head, as though studying her, its eyes hidden beneath the hood. Ivy's heart pounded in her chest as the weight of its gaze settled over her. There was something familiar about it, something she couldn't place. It was as if she had seen it before, in a dream or a memory long buried. Noel stepped in front of her, his hand still gripping her wrist. "Ivy, we need to leave now. This isn't..." Before he could finish his sentence, the figure moved. Its hooded head turned, and it began to glide toward them, its steps impossibly quiet despite the weight of its form. Ivy couldn't tear her eyes away. "Stay back," she said, stepping forward, her voice stronger now, though her heart was racing. "Who are you? What do you want with us?" The figure didn't speak. Instead, it raised one long, slender hand, and Ivy watched in horror as it extended its fingers toward the figure she was holding, the carved woman with the holly and ivy. A chill swept through Ivy's body, and she instinctively pulled the figure closer to her chest, her heart hammering. But the figure's gaze never wavered. It was as if it knew, somehow, that the figure was the key. With a sudden motion, the figure stopped, its hand hovering inches from Ivy's chest. Then, slowly, deliberately, it lowered its hand. For a moment, Ivy thought it would leave them alone. But instead, the figure bent forward, its breath warm against the cold air of the chamber. "You are the one," it whispered, its voice low and rasping. "The one who will unlock the final door. But be warned, the cost will be high." Ivy's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" The figure's hooded head tilted again, and for the briefest moment, Ivy thought she saw something flash in the shadows. Two eyes, dark and ancient, peering from beneath the hood. The figure's lips parted, but before it could speak again, the air in the chamber seemed to shift. A gust of wind blew through the stone walls, rattling the vines and shaking the ground beneath their feet. Ivy stumbled back, her heart racing. She had no idea what was happening, but she could feel the power in the air, an energy that seemed to course through the very stones beneath her feet. The chamber was no longer just a place of stone and earth. It was alive, pulsing with an energy that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "Noel," Ivy shouted, her voice cracking. "We need to leave now." But before Noel could respond, the figure was gone, disappearing into the shadows as though it had never been there. The footsteps ceased, and the chamber fell silent once again. Ivy stood frozen, the figure still clenched tightly in her hand. Her pulse was racing, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "What just happened?" Noel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Ivy replied, her voice shaking. "But I think we've just uncovered something far bigger than we imagined." Noel reached for her arm, pulling her toward the exit. "We'll figure it out later. Right now, we need to get back to the house. Whatever that was, we don't want to be here when it comes back." Ivy nodded, her mind still reeling from the encounter. As they hurried toward the stairs, the feeling of being watched never left her. The grove, the well, the relics, they were all connected, and now she understood why. The past was not just a memory. It was alive, and it was reaching out, pulling them into its tangled web. And the figure was the key to everything. But the question still lingered, burning in Ivy's mind as they ascended the staircase. What was the cost of uncovering the truth? Chapter 9. Whispers in the Journals. The journey back to the house was a blur. Ivy's mind raced, thoughts tumbling over one another in an endless loop, while Noel remained unusually quiet, his eyes darting nervously over their surroundings. He'd insisted they leave the chamber immediately, his usual calm demeanor replaced with urgency. Ivy had complied, but something gnawed at her. The encounter, the figure, its words. The cold air stung her skin, but the chill she felt was far deeper, threading through her bones, settling in her chest where a storm of questions brewed. What had the figure meant when it said she was the one who would unlock the final door? What door? And what was the cost that came with it? They had walked in silence until they reached the house, the lights inside seeming too warm, too ordinary after the strange, ancient darkness they just left behind. Ivy didn't want to return to the normalcy of the house so quickly, not when the air outside still felt charged, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth failing to penetrate the unease she felt. She set the figure and the box on the kitchen table, her fingers lingering over the cold wood as though it could offer some grounding. Noel stood near the doorway, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. His voice, when it came, was low and filled with apprehension. "Ivy, what do you think we're dealing with here?" She swallowed, trying to steady her thoughts. "I don't know." Her voice was soft, uncertain. "But I don't think it's just a hidden relic. I think this whole thing, it's about more than just the grove. It's something older." Noel nodded, though his expression remained clouded with doubt. "I agree. That figure, whatever it was, whoever it was, it seemed to know more about us than we do. About the relics, about the grove. What if it's a warning? What if we're not supposed to uncover the truth?" The idea made Ivy's stomach churn. The thought of leaving things hidden was unbearable to her. But what if the truth is what we need to save the farm? What if this is the only way to stop whatever it is that's been draining the life from the land? Noel's gaze softened as he stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I know you're trying to save the farm, but maybe there's something we're not seeing. Something we're not understanding." Ivy wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the hope that there was a simple solution. But deep down, she knew he was right. They were tangled in something far more complicated than they had ever imagined. The past was alive in the grove, in the journals, in the figure that had appeared to them, and perhaps it was never meant to be uncovered. The fire crackled louder, but the warmth felt distant. "I keep thinking about the journals," Ivy murmured, almost to herself. "They're the key. I know they are. There's something in there that ties all of this together. The grove, the figure, the box." "Maybe we should go back to the journals," Noel suggested. "There's still a lot we haven't read. Maybe there's something else we missed. A clue." The idea of returning to the journals pulled Ivy like a magnetic force. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were right in front of her, buried between the pages, waiting to be found. But even as she nodded, a doubt lingered at the edge of her thoughts. What if the journals weren't enough? What if the figure's warning was true, and they were about to open a door that should have remained closed? Noel didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and walked toward the study, his hand already reaching for the door. Ivy followed, her legs heavy as though the weight of the past had settled on her shoulders. The study was quiet, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. Ivy sat at the desk, the journals spread out in front of her, their pages yellowed with age, their ink faded in places, but the words still legible. She ran her fingers over the delicate pages, feeling the smoothness of the paper beneath her fingertips. Noel took a seat across from her, his eyes scanning the room, his mind clearly still wrestling with the events of the night. Ivy turned to the first journal, the one that had started it all. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the words, looking for anything she had missed before. And then there it was, a passage she hadn't read before. The Holly Grove was not just a place of beauty, but a guardian of secrets. It is said that when the land calls out, when the roots of the trees begin to twist and the winds stir the leaves, the time has come. The one who answers the call will find the key. But be warned, for the cost is great. The earth does not forget. Ivy's heart skipped a beat. The words seemed to echo in her mind, reverberating through her body. She read them again, her fingers tracing the lines of ink, as if the words themselves held a power she could not understand. Noel leaned over her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. "What does it mean?" "I don't know," Ivy replied, her voice a mixture of wonder and fear. "But I think it's telling us that we've already started something that can't be undone. The land is calling to us, Noel. The trees, the grove. They're waiting for something." Noel's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "We can't just ignore it, can we?" Ivy shook her head. "No, I can't. Not when it feels like the whole farm is tied to it. I have to understand what's happening." She turned the page, her mind racing as she read on. But the next few passages only deepened the mystery. There was talk of ancient rituals, of the land's power to grant and withhold, of a guardian spirit bound to the grove. But no matter how much she read, there was one thing that stood out above all else: the cost. The cost is not always what one expects. The price of knowledge is the sacrifice of what one holds dear. In the end, only those willing to give up what they love most will unlock the full truth. Ivy's hand trembled as she set the journal down. The words seemed to burn in her mind. The cost. What was she willing to sacrifice? Do you understand? She asked Noel, her voice thick with emotion. Noel didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. But when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I think we've crossed a line," he said quietly, "and I'm not sure we can go back." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Ivy felt a sinking feeling in her chest, as if the ground beneath her was shifting, slipping away. The cost was not just something from the past. It was something that would come for them now, something that would demand a price, no matter what they did. The weight of the silence between them grew, pressing in on her. It was the silence of understanding, of recognition, that whatever had been set into motion could not be undone. And in that silence, Ivy realized that the tangle of roots they had uncovered was far deeper and far older than they could have ever imagined. The land was alive, and it was calling to them, waiting for them to answer. But Ivy had no idea what would happen if they did. Chapter 10. Frosted Memories. The morning light struggled to break through the thick cloud cover that had lingered over the valley for days. The world outside was painted in shades of gray, as if the landscape had been brushed with a veil of melancholy. Ivy stood by the kitchen window, watching the snow begin to fall again, soft flakes drifting down in a silent ballet. She had always loved the snow, the way it transformed the world into something still and beautiful. But today, it only deepened the feeling that something was wrong, something that was too quiet, too still. Noel's voice broke through the silence. "Ivy, we need to go to the grove." Ivy turned away from the window, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she knew was coming. After what they had uncovered in the journals, after the strange encounter in the chamber beneath the house, there was no escaping it. The land was calling to them, and it wasn't a call they could ignore. But the thought of returning to the grove, to the place that had always been so full of life and memories, now felt different. It felt ominous. The trees, the hollies, everything she thought she knew was now tainted by the secrets of the past. "We don't have much time," Noel added, his voice low. He was standing by the door, his coat already on, the familiar look of determination in his eyes. Ivy nodded. She couldn't ignore him. Not when every part of her knew the answers were out there, buried beneath the snow and the roots of the grove. "I'll be right there," she replied, forcing herself to move toward the back door. Her boots crunched in the snow as she stepped outside, the chill of the air cutting through her layers of clothing. She had not been back to the grove since her father's death, not since the farm had begun to suffer. It felt like another lifetime, like another version of herself. Noel was already ahead of her, his figure cutting through the whiteness of the snow as he made his way toward the line of trees. The air felt heavier as she walked, the silence almost oppressive, the weight of the past pressing down on her with each step. The grove loomed ahead, its ancient trees standing like sentinels, their gnarled branches twisted against the pale sky. The hollies were the most striking, their dark green leaves contrasting sharply with the snow. But it was the feeling of the place that caught Ivy's attention. The air seemed charged, as though the very land was holding its breath. Noel paused in front of her, his hand resting on the rough bark of a tree. "This is where it all began, isn't it?" Ivy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let her fingers trace the deep grooves in the bark, feeling the pulse of the tree beneath her touch. "Yes," she said softly. "My family has always been connected to this land. It's like the land is alive, in a way. It remembers things." Noel looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. And what does it remember, Ivy? She hesitated. It remembers the love story, the one in the journals, the one that was lost. The wind stirred around them, lifting the snow into a soft swirl. Ivy could feel the pull of the grove, as if the trees were calling her to the center, where the heart of the mystery lay hidden. She took a step forward, her boots crunching in the snow as she moved closer to the heart of the grove. It was there, at the edge of the clearing, where the ground seemed to rise in a gentle mound, that Ivy stopped. She had never come this close to the spot before, not in all her years growing up here. It had always felt forbidden, as though the land itself was guarding something precious. Noel stopped beside her, his expression unreadable. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ivy swallowed, her throat tight. "This is where the grove hides its secrets. This is where the roots are buried, where the past sleeps." The snow seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft wind brushing through the trees. Ivy reached down and touched the snow-covered ground, her fingers sinking into the cold earth. There, beneath the snow, she could feel the subtle warmth of the land, the quiet pulse of something ancient and alive. "Do you feel that?" she asked Noel, her voice trembling slightly. "The land is waiting for us." Noel's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, his gaze flickering to the ground beneath their feet. "It's not just waiting for us, Ivy. It's waiting for something more." Ivy nodded slowly. She had always known there was something more to the grove, something beyond the beauty and serenity it presented. It was a place of power, a place of history, and now it was calling them to unearth the past. "I think it's time to dig," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread in her chest. Noel didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression hardening as he moved to kneel beside her. Together, they began to clear away the snow, revealing the earth beneath. The soil was dark and rich, but as Ivy scraped away the last of the snow, something caught her eye. A glint of metal. Her heart raced as she reached down, her fingers brushing against a weathered, rusted object. It was a small box, buried deep in the earth, its edges worn with age. Ivy felt a surge of excitement and fear as she carefully unearthed it, her fingers trembling as she lifted it from the ground. "This is it," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "This is the key." Noel leaned closer, his eyes scanning the box. "What is it?" Ivy didn't answer immediately. She was too mesmerized by the object in her hands. It was small, no larger than a jewelry box, but it was intricately carved with patterns she had never seen before. There was something familiar about it, but she couldn't place it. With trembling hands, she opened the box. Inside was a small, delicate charm, shaped like a holly leaf, its veins etched in gold. It seemed to glow with a faint, ethereal light, as though it were alive. Ivy's breath caught in her throat. "It's beautiful." But as she held the charm in her hand, a voice seemed to whisper in the wind, low and soft, as though it was coming from the earth itself. "The price must be paid." Noel stiffened beside her. "Did you hear that?" Ivy nodded, her eyes wide with fear. The voice, she couldn't be sure, but it felt real, as if the land itself was speaking to them. "The price," she repeated, her voice trembling. "What price?" But the wind only howled, and the snow continued to fall. The trees around them creaked in the cold, their branches shifting as if they were shifting their weight, waiting. Ivy knew then that the moment they had feared was upon them. The secrets of the grove were about to be unlocked, and they would have to face the consequences of what they had uncovered. The charm in her hand seemed to burn with an intensity that made her skin tingle. She had opened the door. Now, it was time to see what lay on the other side. Chapter 11. The Promise of Evergreen. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the grove in a thick layer of white, muffling the world beyond. Ivy stood motionless, the strange charm clutched tightly in her hand. The wind had picked up, swirling around them with a force that seemed to carry something more. An urgency, a warning. Beside her, Noel was still kneeling in the snow, his eyes fixed on the small box she had unearthed from the earth. The rusted edges of the box glinted faintly, as though they, too, had absorbed the weight of time. Noel's gaze flickered between Ivy and the charm, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air around them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of the past pressing down on them both. Ivy swallowed, trying to steady her breath. The charm felt warm against her palm, as though it were alive. Its edges smooth, its intricate design somehow familiar. The pattern of holly leaves, the veins etched in gold, seemed to pulse with an almost mystical energy. It was as if the charm itself had a story to tell, a story that was not her own, but one that had been whispered through generations. "Noel," she finally whispered, her voice strained. "I think we've made a mistake." The words hung between them, heavy and irrevocable. A deep fear lodged itself in Ivy's chest, the kind that made her skin prickle with unease. What had they uncovered? What had they unleashed by digging into the earth and opening the box? Noel stood slowly, dusting the snow off his gloves. He didn't respond immediately, his expression unreadable. But when his eyes met hers, she saw the same uncertainty mirrored there. He was just as afraid as she was, though he was trying to hide it. "I don't know what this is," Ivy continued, looking down at the charm. "But it's not just a trinket. This feels like it's part of something bigger, something that has been buried for a reason." Noel took a step closer, his gaze never leaving the charm. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Ivy said, her voice trembling. "I feel like the land is watching us, waiting." He glanced around, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees, the grove that had always been so familiar to them both. But now, as the charm hummed softly in Ivy's hand, the place felt different, darker, more mysterious. It was as though the trees themselves were shifting, their branches creaking as if they were speaking in a language Ivy didn't understand. Noel reached for the box, his fingers brushing against the cold metal, and for a moment, it seemed like time slowed. Ivy watched, her breath caught in her throat, as he opened the box again. This time, when he looked inside, his eyes widened. There, beneath the charm, was something else, something that had been hidden until now. A letter. Its edges were yellowed with age, its paper delicate and fragile. The ink was faded, almost illegible, but there was no mistaking the seal on the back. A wax seal, stamped with the image of a holly leaf. Ivy's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was a message, a fragment of the past. But from whom? And why had it been hidden so carefully? Without a word, she took the letter from the box. Her fingers trembled as she gently broke the wax seal, the crackle of the old paper echoing in the stillness of the grove. She unfolded it carefully, as though afraid that even the slightest movement might destroy the fragile words written on it. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, though faded in places. Ivy could make out only bits and pieces, but the meaning was clear. The letter was a love letter, a declaration of devotion from someone long gone. But there was something else, something more disturbing in the words. "I cannot bear the weight of this secret any longer. The land is cursed, and I fear it will claim us all. But the choice must be made, and the holly tree will be the final judge. Only through sacrifice can the curse be lifted. If you love me, you must leave this place." The words sent a chill through Ivy's spine. A curse? Sacrifice? It felt as if the letter had been written for her, for this moment. The sense of foreboding deepened, and Ivy felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She looked at Noel, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. "What does it mean?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Ivy replied, her voice shaking. "But it sounds like the land, the grove, it's cursed, and the holly tree. It's the key to everything." Noel took a step back, his brow furrowed. "Ivy, this is insane. We can't just take a letter at face value." "It could be." "I don't think it's just a letter," Ivy interrupted, holding it up. "Look at the seal. The holly leaf. It's the same as the charm. This isn't just some old relic. It's part of the same story, the one we're supposed to uncover." Noel's expression faltered, as if he were struggling to understand. "So you think the curse is real?" Ivy nodded slowly, her mind racing. "I don't know, but something is happening here, Noel. The land, this farm, this grove, it's tied to everything. The farm is dying, the trees are dying, and I think it's because of whatever happened all those years ago." The silence hung thick in the air. It was as though the grove itself was listening to them, waiting for them to make their next move. Ivy could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, the invisible threads that connected the present to the past, binding them to a story that wasn't theirs, but that they had somehow become a part of. Noel's voice broke the stillness. "What do we do now?" Ivy swallowed hard, her thoughts tumbling over each other. "We need to find out more. We need to go deeper. There's more to this, Noel. There's a reason why this charm, this letter, was buried. And I think we're meant to finish what was started, whatever it takes." Noel nodded slowly, though his eyes still held a trace of doubt. "If you're right, then we're not just dealing with a curse. We're dealing with something that could change everything." Ivy looked down at the charm, feeling its heat beneath her fingertips. The choice had been made. The secrets of the grove were no longer hidden, and now it was up to them to face whatever waited beneath the snow, beneath the roots, and beneath the surface of time. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The past had been buried for a reason, but now it was rising again, and Ivy knew there was no turning back. Chapter 12. Entwined by the season. The night descended swiftly, its icy breath sweeping through the grove. Ivy could feel the change in the air as they made their way back to the farmhouse. The charm still warm in her pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the secret they had unearthed. The snow crunched beneath their boots, but the silence that surrounded them was heavy, almost suffocating. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, and Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something much larger than they could comprehend. Noel walked beside her, his expression unreadable, lost in thought. He had been quiet since they uncovered the letter, his eyes flickering between her and the grove as if trying to piece together the puzzle in his mind. Ivy had noticed the way he looked at her, though there was a hesitation in his gaze, a wariness that hadn't been there before. She wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but the words felt stuck in her throat. It wasn't just the mystery of the charm or the letter that was weighing on her mind. It was the strange sense of inevitability, the feeling that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Every step they took felt like they were walking deeper into a story that had already been written, a story where their actions were already predestined. "Do you think it's real?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. Noel glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The curse. The letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's real?" For a long moment, Noel didn't respond. He glanced up at the farmhouse ahead, its lights flickering through the trees, and then back at her. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I want to believe it's just an old story, something someone made up to explain the bad things that happened. But the charm, the way it feels, the letter, there's something about it that's hard to ignore." Ivy nodded, her gaze fixed on the grove in the distance. It feels like we've opened something that was meant to stay closed. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if trying to shake off the weight of the conversation. Maybe we did, but that doesn't mean we can't fix it. Maybe it's not too late to undo whatever's been done. Ivy's heart ached at the thought. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could somehow turn back time, that they could save the farm and the land before it was too late. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The grove had its own rhythm, its own pulse, and she had a feeling that it wouldn't let them walk away easily. The land had chosen them, whether they were ready or not. As they reached the farmhouse, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees like a distant, mournful song. Ivy paused on the porch, glancing out over the snow-covered fields. The grove was still there, its silhouette dark against the evening sky. The holly trees standing tall and imposing, their branches heavy with snow. She had always loved the grove. As a child, it had been a place of refuge, a place where she could escape into the quiet, where the world seemed to slow down and let her breathe. But now, it felt different. The grove had become something else, a place where the past and present collided, where memories from long ago lingered like shadows, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Noel turned to look at her, a confused expression on his face. "Hear what?" "The wind," Ivy said, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "It sounds like whispers." Noel stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "Whispers? Ivy, there's no one out here but us." She shook her head. "It's not like people. It's different. It's almost like the land itself is speaking to us." He didn't say anything at first, but Ivy could see the skepticism in his eyes. He didn't believe her. She didn't blame him. She didn't fully believe it herself. But there was something about the way the wind sounded. Something ancient, something filled with longing. "I think I need to go inside," she said after a moment, her voice shaky. "It's too cold out here." Noel nodded, his gaze still lingering on the grove. "We should go in. Get warm." They stepped inside, and Ivy immediately felt the warmth of the fire in the living room, the familiar smell of pine and cinnamon filling the air. But even as the warmth seeped into her skin, the unease remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something, or someone, was waiting just beyond the door. Noel set his coat aside, his eyes still distant as he glanced at the fire. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice low. Ivy stared at the flames, her thoughts racing. The letter had made everything feel so much more real, more urgent. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the stories of the people who had lived here before her, who had worked this land and loved it as she had. And she could feel something else, too, a pull, as if the land itself was calling her, asking her to finish what had been started. "I think we need to find more," she said, her voice resolute. "We need to understand what happened here. Why the holly grove? Why the curse? There's more to this, Noel. I can feel it." He watched her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll help you," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes." Ivy looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew this wasn't easy for him. He had always been a practical man, grounded in the present, in what was tangible. But something had shifted between them, something that went beyond the charm and the letter. There was a bond between them now, one forged by the land and the mysteries it held. "I know," she said softly, "but we have to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." Noel stepped closer, his expression serious. "I'll be with you, Ivy. We'll figure this out together." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, and for a moment, Ivy allowed herself to relax. But only for a moment. She knew that tomorrow would bring more questions, more discoveries, and perhaps even more dangers. But one thing was certain, There was no turning back now. The past was calling, and Ivy couldn't ignore it any longer. As she looked out the window toward the grove, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing among the trees. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. It was only the wind, she told herself. Only the wind. But even as the thought crossed her mind, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that the land was waiting for her to make the next move. And the whispers, though faint, seemed to grow louder in the wind. Chapter 13. Hollows of the Heart. The morning after the whispers in the wind, Ivy woke with a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. The air in the farmhouse felt heavier than usual, thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets she was too afraid to uncover. The events of the previous day, the discovery of the letter, the charm, the growing sense of something ancient stirring beneath the surface, had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She stood at the window, staring out toward the grove, the snow now freshly fallen, coating the trees in a blanket of white. The holly grove, once a place of childhood wonder, now seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't define. A quiet power that drew her in with an irresistible pull. She wanted to understand it, needed to understand it, but she also feared what she might find. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She turned, her heart jumping in her chest. It was too early for Noel, she thought. He usually slept in a little longer after working late the night before. But when she opened the door, it was him, standing there with a fresh determination in his eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice steady, though there was something different about him today, a resolve that hadn't been there before. "Morning," Ivy replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't expect you so early." Noel shrugged, running a hand through his hair. "I couldn't sleep. Figured we might as well get a head start. There's more to this than we thought, right?" Ivy nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the doorframe as she considered his words. "Yes, there's more. I can feel it." He looked out the window toward the grove. "I've been thinking about it all night. About the letter, the charm, and that grove. Something about it feels wrong, doesn't it? Like it's tied to something we can't fully understand yet." Ivy met his gaze, her heart quickening. "Exactly. It's as if the land is holding something back. But what?" Noel stepped closer, his brow furrowed in thought. "Whatever it is, I think it's time we found out." They stood there for a moment, both of them watching the snow swirl in the wind, but Ivy couldn't stop her mind from racing. What was it about this grove, this land, that had such a hold over them? And what was the connection between the old love story in the letter and the present? There was a thread connecting them, a line running from the past into their present, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to follow it. But the pull was undeniable. "I think we should go back to the grove," Ivy said suddenly. Her voice trembled slightly, but she was certain now. "We need to get closer. We have to see what it's hiding." Noel's eyes met hers, hesitation flickering in his expression. "Are you sure? After last night?" "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady now. "There's something there. I feel it. And we won't know what it is until we face it." Noel looked at her for a long moment, as though measuring her resolve. Then, with a nod, he grabbed his coat and followed her outside. The cold air hit them as they stepped out onto the porch, the wind biting at their faces. But Ivy didn't flinch. She was ready, though part of her heart still beat faster at the thought of returning to the grove. It felt like stepping into the unknown, into something ancient that had been waiting for her. For them. They walked together in silence, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The grove loomed ahead, its tall holly trees standing like silent sentinels, their dark green leaves and red berries stark against the white snow. The sight of it sent a shiver down Ivy's spine, but she pressed on, determined to discover the truth. The closer they got to the grove, the stronger the feeling became. The air seemed to hum with energy, as though the very earth beneath them was alive, aware of their presence. Ivy's pulse quickened as they reached the edge of the trees. She looked at Noel, who was now standing beside her, his eyes scanning the grove with the same mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What do you think it's hiding?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Ivy murmured, stepping cautiously forward. "But I think we're about to find out." They ventured deeper into the grove, the trees towering over them like ancient guardians. Ivy could hear the faint rustling of leaves above, but there was no breeze. It was as if the grove was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the next move. She glanced at Noel, who was now walking beside her, his expression focused but tense. Suddenly, Ivy stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. There, just ahead, was a small clearing, partially hidden by the thick branches of the holly trees. And in the center of the clearing was something she hadn't expected, a stone monument, weathered with age, its surface covered in ivy and moss. The stone was shaped like a pedestal, and there, etched into the stone, was an inscription she couldn't quite make out. "Look at that," Noel whispered, stepping closer. Ivy felt a chill run through her as she approached the monument. The air around it seemed thicker, heavier. She knelt beside it, brushing away the moss and ivy, revealing the inscription. It was in an old, nearly forgotten language, one she had seen only in the journals from the attic. The letters were faint, worn down by centuries of weather and time, but she could make out enough to know that it was a warning. A curse. "Noel," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's all here. Everything we've been looking for." He bent down beside her, his eyes widening as he read the words. This is it, isn't it? This is what's been hidden all this time." Ivy's heart raced as she traced the inscription with her fingers. It spoke of love lost, of promises broken, and of a curse that had been bound to the land itself. A curse that had never been lifted. And as she read, the whispers from the wind seemed to grow louder, like voices calling out from the past, urging her to understand. "This is what we've been searching for," Ivy said, her voice barely audible. "This is what's been keeping the land from healing." She stood up, her legs trembling beneath her, as the weight of the truth settled over her. The land was cursed, not just by the lost love, but by the actions of those who had come before them. The charm, the letter, the grove, it was all connected. The curse had never been broken, and now, it seemed, it was her responsibility to do so. Noel stood up beside her, his face pale as he took in the monument. "What do we do now?" Ivy swallowed hard, her mind racing. The answer seemed clear, though she wasn't sure how she would accomplish it. The curse had to be undone, but the question remained. Could they break it before it was too late? She looked at Noel, her eyes filled with determination. "We finish what was started," she said softly. "We break the curse." And as she spoke those words, the wind howled through the trees, as though in response, and the whispers grew louder, as though the land itself had heard her vow. Chapter 14. A Light Through the Pines. The journey back to the farmhouse was quiet, each step heavier than the last. Ivy could feel the weight of the discovery pressing on her chest, as if the air itself had thickened since they found the monument. The words on the stone, the curse etched into the land's history, loomed in her thoughts, swirling like a storm cloud. Every glance she stole at Noel told her that he, too, was feeling the enormity of what they'd uncovered. They didn't speak as they walked through the grove, and when they finally reached the edge of the property, it was as if the world itself had held its breath, waiting for them to make sense of what they had found. The snow had begun to fall again, dusting their shoulders as they trudged toward the house. But the landscape felt different now, darker, as if the trees were watching them with eyes that had seen too much. Once inside, Ivy didn't know where to begin. She moved to the kitchen, the warmth of the fire a welcome relief from the biting cold, but it didn't ease the weight in her chest. She glanced over at Noel, who stood by the door, his face drawn in thought, his mind clearly still tangled in the mystery they were now entangled in. The silence stretched between them like a tangible thing, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Ivy spoke, her voice a little shaky. "The curse. It has to be broken. But how?" Noel stepped forward, taking a seat at the worn wooden table. His hand rested on its surface, as if searching for something solid to anchor him. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we'll have to do it together. You're not alone in this, Ivy." Ivy nodded, grateful for his words, but they didn't quite ease the trembling inside her. She walked to the window and stared out into the grove, her mind racing. There had to be something in the journals, something they missed in their haste to understand. She turned, her gaze sweeping over the room, her eyes landing on the staircase leading to the attic. Noel followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You think there's something else up there?" "I don't know," Ivy said, her hand pressing against the window pane. "I think there's more." The journal spoke of love and of a binding, but not how to break it. "We need to understand what was done here and why it was never undone." The quiet that followed her words felt heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, Noel stood up, brushing snow from his coat. "Let's go then. If there's more to uncover, we'll find it." Ivy looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she was relying on him, how much she had come to depend on his steady presence in the midst of everything. And yet, there was still so much between them that remained unspoken. The past, their history, hovered over them, a constant reminder of what they once were and what they could never be again. But for now, it didn't matter. The curse was all that mattered. They made their way to the attic, the stairs creaking underfoot. The space up there felt smaller than she remembered, the rafters low and the air musty with age. The dusty boxes sat in their usual haphazard piles, as if time had forgotten about them altogether. Ivy moved toward the trunk that had contained the journals, and her fingers hesitated on the latch. "Are you sure we want to do this?" Noel's voice cut through the silence, low and uncertain. Ivy nodded, her throat tight. "We don't have a choice. We need to know everything." With a deep breath, she opened the trunk. The journals lay inside, their worn leather covers still fragile after all these years. But something caught her eye, a small, silver key tucked beneath the stack of papers. It was delicate, ornate, and seemed entirely out of place in the dusty old chest. "What's this?" she murmured, picking it up carefully. Noel moved closer, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but it looks like it belongs to something." Ivy examined the key, turning it over in her hands. "It's strange. It's too small for a door, maybe a locket or a box." Her fingers traced the edge of it. But why would it be in here with the journals? Without a word, Noel moved closer to the chest, his eyes scanning the inside once more. Maybe it unlocked something. Something hidden. Ivy's heart skipped a beat. Do you think there's another letter? Another clue?" They exchanged a look, the same thought racing through both their minds. Could there be another part to the story? One they hadn't found yet? One that would lead them to a solution? She stood up, her mind made up. "We need to find what this key unlocks." With a final glance at Noel, Ivy headed for the back of the house, where the old chest of drawers sat. It was a piece that had been in the family for as long as she could remember, its solid oak frame weathered with time, its drawers often filled with odds and ends, things of little importance until now. She pulled open each drawer, but they were all empty, except for the bottom one. Ivy bent down, the cool wood creaking beneath her touch as she pulled the drawer open. Inside was a small, old-fashioned lockbox. The silver key fit perfectly into the lock, turning with a soft click. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside the box was a faded photograph, two people standing under the holly tree in the grove, their hands intertwined, their faces barely visible in the black and white image. Beneath the photo was another letter, this one in a script she recognized, the handwriting from the first letter, the one they had found in the attic. Noel moved closer, his breath catching when he saw the photograph. "Who are they?" "I think they're the ones the journal spoke about," Ivy said, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the letter. It read, "When the holly blooms again, so will our love. But until then, we must wait, for the curse cannot be lifted until the land heals its broken heart. We were wrong, but hope lives, buried beneath the snow." Ivy's pulse quickened as she read the words aloud. The curse wasn't just about love lost. It was about healing. Healing the land. Healing what had been broken. What does it mean? Noel whispered, his eyes fixed on the letter. Ivy looked at him, the answer clear now, even if the path wasn't. It means we have to restore what was lost. We have to heal the land, and in doing so, break the curse. She looked at the photograph again, the faces of the couple hauntingly familiar in their love and their sorrow. There was something more to this story, something more than either of them could have expected. But now, Ivy knew, this was their next step. They had to go back to the grove, back to the heart of it all, and restore what had been broken so long ago. And as they made their way back to the grove, a new sense of purpose drove them forward. They had no idea what the final steps of their journey would entail, but one thing was clear. The past was not finished with them yet. Chapter 15. The Gilded Grove. The morning light filtered through the frosted trees as Ivy and Noel stood at the edge of the holly grove. The snow had stopped falling for now, leaving the world still and pristine. A blank canvas waiting for the final brushstrokes. The grove was silent, the air crisp with the promise of winter, but beneath it all was a sense of expectancy, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the next move. Ivy's fingers brushed against the trunk of the nearest holly tree. The leaves were dark green and glossy, but there was something about them now, something that hadn't been there before. She could almost feel the pulse of the land beneath her fingertips, as if it were alive, as if it were remembering what had been lost so long ago. Noel stood beside her, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on the grove ahead. He hadn't spoken much since the discovery of the letter and the photograph, but she could sense the same urgency in him that she felt in herself. The weight of what they were about to do pressed on them both, and there was no going back. "I think we're getting close," Ivy said, her voice breaking the silence. "We have the key, and we know what it means now. The curse isn't just about love. It's about healing the land." Noel nodded, his eyes moving over the grove. "It's as if we're supposed to restore something that was taken." Ivy's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The love story in the journals, the curse, the photograph. It was all part of a puzzle, one that they had to solve before it was too late. She looked back at the land, the snow-covered ground stretching out before them, and then at the holly trees, their berries bright red against the winter backdrop. "Do you think the grove is the key?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think the grove holds the answers," Noel replied, his gaze intense. "Whatever happened here, whatever was lost, it started here. We need to figure out how to bring it back." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the task before them settling into their bones. Ivy felt a shiver run through her, but it wasn't from the cold. It was something deeper, something that had to do with the history buried in the grove, in the land itself. She could feel the pulse of it, slow, steady, like a heartbeat. "Let's go deeper," Ivy said, her voice steady now. We need to see if there's anything more in the grove. Something that will help us understand what happened." Noel nodded, and they began walking toward the heart of the grove, where the trees grew thicker and the shadows seemed to deepen. The further they walked, the more the air seemed to shift around them. The ground beneath their feet felt different now, as if it were yielding to their presence, opening up to them in a way it hadn't before. The trees grew taller as they ventured further, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches stretching high above them like ancient arms reaching for the sky. The holly trees seemed to pulse with life, their red berries glistening in the weak sunlight. But there was something else, something hidden deep within the grove. Ivy could feel it, a strange energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface of the land. And then they saw it. At the center of the grove was a stone altar, half buried in the snow, covered with moss and ivy. The stones were weathered with age, but the intricate carvings on its surface were still visible, though time had taken its toll. Ivy stepped closer, her heart racing. The altar was the missing piece, the connection between the past and the present, between the curse and its eventual resolution. "This is it," she breathed, her fingers tracing the edge of the stone. "This is where it happened." Noel stood beside her, his eyes wide as he took in the sight. "What is this place?" "It's where the curse was born," Ivy whispered. "This is where the binding took place." She could feel the energy radiating from the stones, the pull of the past wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. The altar seemed to be waiting for something, as if it had been waiting for centuries for someone to finally come and break the curse. Ivy stepped closer to the altar, her mind racing. The letter had spoken of the curse being tied to the land's broken heart. It was here, in this very spot, that the love story had come to an end, and it was here that they needed to begin the process of healing. "I think we have to restore something," Ivy said, her voice barely audible. "But what?" Noel stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the altar. "Maybe it's not just about love. Maybe it's about forgiveness." Ivy turned to him, surprised by his insight. "Forgiveness?" He nodded. "It makes sense. The land, the trees, everything here feels like it's been scarred by something, like it's carrying the weight of the past. If we can forgive, maybe that's how the curse will break." Ivy swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. Forgiveness. Could that be it? Could forgiveness be the key to healing both the land and the love that had been lost? She thought about the couple in the photograph. Their love had been pure, but it had been marred by something they couldn't overcome. "I think you're right," Ivy said slowly, her voice filled with determination. "Forgiveness. But who do we forgive?" Noel turned to her, his expression softening. "Maybe we need to forgive ourselves first." Ivy met his gaze, her heart fluttering in her chest. There it was, the truth, the key they had been searching for. It wasn't just about the land or the curse, it was about them, too. They had been running from each other for years, each of them holding on to old wounds, old regrets. But forgiveness, true forgiveness, was the first step toward healing. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the cold stone of the altar. "I forgive you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she even knew she was saying them. "For everything." Noel's eyes softened, his voice low and steady. "And I forgive you, Ivy, for everything too." As they stood there, surrounded by the holly trees and the ancient altar, a sense of peace settled over them. The land seemed to respond, the wind picking up, rustling through the trees, as if acknowledging their words. Ivy closed her eyes, feeling the shift in the air, the change in the atmosphere. The curse wasn't broken yet, but they had made the first step. They had forgiven each other, and the land had felt it. Now, they had to take the next step, whatever that might be. But for the first time, Ivy felt like they were on the right path. The curse could be lifted. The land could be healed. And maybe, just maybe, their love, once lost, could be found again. Chapter 16. Winds of Reclamation. The night had fallen quietly around them, wrapping the grove in a blanket of stillness. The sky was dark, but the stars seemed closer than ever, as if they had heard the soft words of forgiveness that had echoed through the heart of the holly grove. Ivy stood alone in the snow, the wind now stirring gently through the branches above her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope, a spark, a light, somewhere beneath the heavy weight of everything that had come before. The altar behind her seemed almost alive now, its stone surface glowing faintly in the moonlight, as though it were waiting for something, waiting for the final, decisive moment. Ivy turned to face it once again, the words they had spoken still lingering in the air like a prayer, a promise. She was unsure of what had truly happened between them, but there was something tangible, something she could feel deep in her bones. It was as though the very land was shifting, letting go of its ancient wounds and ready to embrace whatever came next. Behind her, Noel's footsteps crunched softly in the snow, his presence a quiet reminder of everything they had uncovered, everything they had shared. She didn't turn around, knowing he was there, just as he had been since the beginning of this journey. He had been there through all the discoveries, all the revelations, and now, perhaps, he would be there to witness the final piece fall into place. Ivy. His voice broke the silence, low and steady. "I think it's time." She nodded, though she wasn't sure if he could see it. Time? Time for what? Time for everything to be revealed? Or was it time for them to walk away, to leave the grove and all its mysteries behind? Noel's voice came again, softer this time. "We've found the key, but there's something else we need to do." Ivy turned then, her heart in her throat. "What do you mean?" "There's still one piece left," he said, his eyes dark and thoughtful. "We need to make a choice." Ivy swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. A choice. The word echoed in her mind, reverberating like the sound of a bell. She had always thought that the curse was the thing holding them back, the thing they needed to break. But now, in the quiet of the grove, she realized that it wasn't just the land that needed healing. It wasn't just the curse they needed to face. It was themselves. Noel stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow, until they were standing together, side by side, in front of the altar. "The choice is this," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "We can stay here, in the past, in the stories we've uncovered, in the mistakes we've made. Or we can leave all of that behind and move forward." Ivy felt the rush of emotion, a flood of things she hadn't known she was holding on to. Her childhood, the broken promises, the loss of love, and the fear that had kept her from coming home for so long. She had buried all of it, buried it deep within the walls of this place, within the cold, unforgiving snow that had blanketed her heart for so long. But here, now, in the place where everything had started, it was time to let it go. "I don't know how to move forward," Ivy said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what it would look like." Noel's hand reached for hers, his fingers warm against the cold, a steady anchor in the storm of her thoughts. "It's not about knowing, Ivy. It's about choosing. We can't go back to what was, but we can choose what happens next." Ivy took a deep breath, staring at the altar in front of them, the ancient stone now bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight. The choice felt impossible, heavy, but it was theirs to make, and she realized, with a clarity that settled in her chest, that it wasn't about the land or the curse anymore. It was about them, about choosing to heal, to forgive, and to step forward together. She squeezed Noel's hand, a silent promise passing between them. It wasn't perfect. Nothing would ever be perfect, but they had already made the most difficult choice. To face what was broken and to try, together, to mend it. "Let's do it," Ivy whispered, her voice strong now. "Let's move forward." With that, they both stepped forward, together, toward the altar. As they reached it, Ivy could feel the change in the air, a crackling, a buzz, as though the land itself was waking from a long slumber, stretching out toward the future with them. Noel gently placed his other hand on the stone, his eyes meeting Ivy's with a look that spoke more than words ever could. In that moment, they both understood. This was the final step. This was the moment the land, and their hearts, had been waiting for. They had come full circle, and now they were ready to begin again. The air around them seemed to hum with energy as Ivy closed her eyes, her heart racing. For a moment, the wind shifted, the trees rustling in a rhythm that felt almost like a sigh of relief. She took a deep breath, feeling the energy course through her, filling her with a sense of peace she hadn't known she could have. And then, as if the world itself had exhaled, the snow around them began to melt, slowly at first, then more rapidly, as the land started to breathe again. The snow receded, the frozen earth giving way to the warmth of something new, something hopeful. The curse had been broken. The land was healing. But more importantly, Ivy realized, so were they. The holly trees glowed in the night, their red berries brighter than before, their leaves standing tall and proud, as though they had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Ivy to make her choice. The curse, the weight of the past, it had all been lifted, and in its place, something new had taken root, something beautiful, and together, they would see it grow. Chapter 17. The Holly's Gift. The morning sun rose over the farm, casting long shadows across the fields. The once frozen ground, which had held its breath for so long, now thawed beneath the gentle caress of the new light. Ivy stood by the window of the farmhouse, her eyes drawn to the holly grove in the distance, now bathed in the soft warmth of the early winter sun. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What had once been a place of shadows and silence, where only the barest whisper of life lingered, was now a place full of promise. The trees stood taller, their leaves vibrant and green, their berries gleaming like rubies. It felt as if the land itself had been reborn. And so had she. Behind her, the house was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth and the distant sounds of Noel moving around downstairs. She had woken early, as she often did now, to watch the sunrise, to watch the first rays of light kiss the land that had been so broken and now, slowly, was being restored. She could still feel the lingering pulse of the night before, the moment when everything had changed, the moment when she and Noel had chosen to let go of their past and step forward into the future. It had been more than a promise to the land. It had been a promise to themselves, to each other. The door creaked open behind her, and Ivy turned to find Noel standing in the doorway. His face was still sleepy, but his eyes held the same quiet intensity that had drawn her to him all those years ago. "Morning," he said softly, stepping into the room. His voice was warm, a comfort in the cool air of the morning. Ivy smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Morning," she echoed, her gaze flickering back to the grove. "It's beautiful out there." Noel joined her at the window, his eyes following her gaze. "It is," he agreed, his voice thoughtful. "It's hard to believe everything's changed so quickly. The land, it's like it's alive again." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words deep in her bones. The healing had begun in earnest. The snow had melted away, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden for so long. The once barren fields now showed signs of life, with tiny shoots of green pushing their way up through the soil. And in the grove, the holly trees stood strong, their roots deep in the earth, grounding everything around them. The memory of the altar, the place where they had forgiven themselves and each other, lingered in the back of her mind. It was as though the land had absorbed their forgiveness, their willingness to move forward, and now it was returning that energy to them in the form of new life. Ivy turned to face Noel, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and something else, something deeper, more profound. "We've done it," she said quietly. "We've brought the farm back." Noel looked at her, his expression softening. "We've brought it back together," he said. "And that's what matters." There was a silence between them then, a shared moment of understanding that spoke volumes more than words ever could. They had done more than save the farm. They had saved themselves. And in doing so, they had given the land a second chance. "I've been thinking," Ivy began, her voice tentative. "Maybe it's time for us to think about what's next. For the farm, for us." Noel raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. "What do you mean?" "Well," Ivy said, feeling a spark of excitement rise within her, "we've always talked about expanding the farm, about making it something more than just a tree farm. Maybe now's the time. Maybe we can restore it to what it once was, and more." Noel's expression softened, and he stepped closer to her, taking her hand in his. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We've already brought life back to the land. Now, we can help it grow in new ways. Together." Ivy smiled, her heart full. This was the beginning of something new, something they would build together. The past was behind them, the land healed, and now it was time to move forward into a future they had only dared to imagine before. A future where they worked side by side, where their love, like the land, would grow and flourish in the years to come. "I think we have the perfect place to start," Ivy said softly, glancing out the window at the grove. "The holly grove. It's been waiting for us, just like the rest of the farm." Noel nodded, his fingers tightening around hers. "It's always been there," he said, "waiting for us to see it for what it truly is." Ivy's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at him, seeing not only the man she had known for so many years, but the partner she had finally found in him. The man who had stood by her, who had helped her heal, and who now stood beside her, ready to build a life they both wanted. "We're ready," Ivy whispered, "for everything that comes next." Noel smiled, his eyes soft with affection. "Yes, we are." Together, they stepped away from the window and made their way down the stairs. The house was warm, the fire crackling softly, and the scent of fresh pine and cinnamon filled the air. The kitchen, where they had shared so many quiet moments in the days before, was alive with the sound of Noel making breakfast. Ivy paused at the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame. "This is what we've been waiting for," she said, more to herself than to Noel. "This is what we've needed." Noel turned to her, his smile warm and full of promise. "And we'll keep waiting for each other. Together." As Ivy joined him in the kitchen, the warmth of the fire mirrored the warmth in her chest. Everything that had come before had led them here. This moment, this new beginning. And just like the farm, just like the holly grove, their love had taken root. It was growing, and it would continue to grow, each day stronger than the last. The world outside was changing, the earth beginning to thaw and bloom once more. And so, too, was their love, rising like the new shoots of spring, ready to embrace the future with open arms. The choice had been made. The land had healed. And now, Ivy and Noel would build their future together, in the light of the snow that had once held their past, but no longer could. Chapter 18. Evergreen Hearts. The day was clear, crisp with the kind of cold that only winter could bring. The sun hung low in the sky, its light soft, casting long shadows across the farm. Ivy stood at the edge of the holly grove, her breath clouding in the cool air. The trees were alive with color, their bright red berries glowing against the dark green of the leaves. It was as though the land had been waiting for this moment, this culmination of everything they had worked for, everything they had hoped for. Beside her, Noel stood quietly, his hand resting gently on the trunk of one of the holly trees. The soft rustle of the leaves in the wind was the only sound between them, a peaceful hum that seemed to carry with it the weight of their journey. The farm, the trees, the land. All of it had changed since they had first come back here, but it was more than just the earth that had been transformed. It was them too. Their past, their struggles, their long-lost love. It had all been reawakened in this grove, in this place where the past and the future had collided. "I can't believe how far we've come," Ivy murmured, her voice barely louder than the wind. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of the tree beside her, feeling its strength beneath her touch. "It feels like it was all a dream, but here we are." Noel smiled softly beside her, his eyes scanning the grove with the same sense of awe that had been present since they had first begun their work here. "It's not a dream," he said quietly. "It's real. It's ours." For a long moment, they simply stood there, together, in the heart of the grove that had become the symbol of their journey. The land had healed, the curse had been lifted, and now, there was only the future to look forward to, a future that was full of possibilities, possibilities they would face side by side. "I think it's time we officially reopen the farm," Noel said, breaking the silence. Ivy turned to him, her heart swelling with a mixture of excitement and nerves. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice a little breathless. "After everything we've been through, we're ready?" Noel nodded, his expression serious but full of hope. "More than ready. We've worked hard, Ivy. We've turned this place around. And now, it's time to share it with the world. People need to see this, see what we've built." Ivy's heart swelled, and for a moment, she thought she might burst from the joy of it all. They had spent years rebuilding not only the farm but their lives, their love. And now, it was finally time to share it with others, to share their story, their success, and everything they had achieved together. "Then let's do it," she said with a smile, her eyes meeting Noel's. "Let's open it up. Let's show everyone the magic we've found here." Noel smiled back, his gaze soft and full of affection. "I knew you'd say that." Together, they turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, their footsteps leaving prints in the fresh snow. The farmhouse was quiet, the warmth of the fire inside a welcoming contrast to the chill outside. As they entered, the scent of fresh pine and the lingering smell of cinnamon filled the air. The house felt more like a home now, a place where they could settle into the life they had created, a life full of love, of promise, and of hope. "I've been thinking," Ivy began, as they made their way into the kitchen, "about the first time I came back here, how unsure I was, how afraid I was of everything, of the land, of the past, and of us." Noel looked at her, his expression soft. "I know," he said quietly. "I remember. But look at us now." Ivy smiled, her fingers brushing against his hand as they walked through the kitchen. "Look at us now," she echoed. "We've made it through. Together." They stood for a moment in the kitchen, looking around at the familiar surroundings. The farmhouse, the land, the grove. It was all theirs. It was real, and it was theirs to shape however they wished. The journey had been long, filled with uncertainty and struggle, but the rewards had been greater than they ever could have imagined. "There's something else," Ivy said, her voice serious. "A promise I made to myself a long time ago. A promise that I would make this farm everything it was meant to be. And I'm ready to do that. I'm ready to turn this place into something people can come to, where they can experience the magic of this land, of what we've built." Noel's eyes brightened, and he took her hand in both of his fingers warm against hers. "We're already doing it, Ivy," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. We've already made it happen. Together. The weight of those words hung in the air between them, grounding them, tying them to this place, this moment. They had already done it. They had taken the land, their love, and their lives and turned them into something beautiful, something lasting. Ivy looked out the window, her gaze drifting to the holly grove once again. The trees stood tall, their roots deep in the earth, their branches reaching toward the sky. It was as though they were a reflection of her and Noel, rooted, strong, and ready to grow. She turned back to him, her heart full. "Let's make this farm everything it was always meant to be," she said, her voice filled with determination. Noel's smile deepened, his love for her shining in his eyes. "We already have." The promise of the future stretched out before them, wide and open, full of hope and possibility. They had chosen each other, chosen the land, and chosen to move forward with no more fear, no more doubts. They had found their way back to each other, and in doing so, they had created something that would last, a love, a home, and a legacy that would grow with every passing year. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth and the snow continued to fall gently outside, Ivy knew, deep in her heart, that this was only the beginning. The land had healed, and so had they. Together, they had planted the roots of something that would last long after the winter had passed. And with every new season, their love and their farm would continue to grow, ever strong, ever true. And as the holly trees swayed gently in the wind, Ivy whispered one final promise to herself, to the land, and to Noel. "We'll always grow."